Let me welcome you to the very last event of this year's, what has been quite an exciting year for us at the History Seminar Series. I want to thank my colleague Adnan Hussain, who was the co-director of this series with me this year. Thanks to the department staff for their constant, and I may add, vigilant support throughout the year. Thanks to our chair, Jimmy Carson, who never says no to anything we have asked him. I would like to thank Hina Mistry, who served as the operations coordinator for the series this year. Jeff Collins and the GHSA for your support, uniform support and participation. And let me also thank Principal Wolf for taking time from his busy schedule this morning and coming here on this occasion. Let me say a few words about our very distinguished guest this morning. David Armitage is the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Harvard University. He is an historian of British intellectual history and global history, but has also made lasting contributions to the fields of Atlantic history, Civil War history, history of the British Empire, and now history of the Pacific War. He's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and an Honorary Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Before I talk a bit about his work, let me take a few moments and talk about something of a curious coincidence. Professor Armitage was born on the same day that Winston Churchill was buried. And you might be curious why I'm mentioning such a passing incidental and even trivial fact. If you are curious, let me just read one from one of his recent interviews where he writes that the weekend the British Empire was buried in the figure of Winston Churchill was a rather appropriate time for a self-consciously post-imperial historian to be born. He was born as a part of a generation of historians that would regard the British Empire as history, as something to look back on, but no longer as a living force. Perhaps this coincidental context has shaped Professor Armitage's intellectual trajectory and scholarship. At my last count, he's the author or editor of 14 books. He disagrees, it seems it's 13. Amongst them, The Ideological Origins of the British Empire, which won the Longman History Today Book of the Year, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, that won the Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year award. And most recently, just last year, he published Foundations of Modern International Thought, in addition to several edited or co-edited volumes, most notably Shakespeare and Early Modern Political Thought, The British Atlantic War, and just this year, Pacific Histories. Apart from these monographs and books, Professor Armitage has published numerous articles in some of the most distinguished venues. Now, beyond all the honors and publications, I want to underline a key aspect of Professor Armitage's career that I found to be quite striking. In 1997, in a Harvard symposium, Professor Armitage proclaimed that we are all Atlanticists now. In 2012, in response to the question, are we all global historians now? Professor Armitage responded by saying, and I quote, "This formulation will get me into trouble, but let me nevertheless put it in these strong terms. If you're not doing an explicitly transnational, international, or global project, you now have to explain why you are not. The hegemony of national historiography is open." More recently, he has called for the turn to Pacific histories, and finally, to the return of the long delay. This ability to identify, insist upon, and render on vogue some of the most recent historiographic terms makes Professor Armitage important, enormously relevant, and exigent. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David.
Thank you, Amitabh, for that extraordinarily warm and generous introduction. And thank you all so much for coming out at the end of the semester as well. I know this is a very busy time for all of you, not least for the principal. I'm very delighted to see Daniel Wolf again after many, many years today here, and to see so many friends, old and new, in the audience today. I will, in fact, end, or close to end, with a quotation from Winston Churchill, since I feel a little of his spirit after me, 31st of January 1965, but I won't do any more impressions, don't worry about that. Now, as Amitabh mentioned, Something that's actually putting a drag on my career at the moment is that I'm chair of my own department. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the future of history with a capital H in my capacity as a department chair. When friends have been asking me recently what it's like to be chair, on bad days I refer them to the dictionary definition, a thing upon which people sit. On good days, however, I tell them it's a great chance to think broadly, not just about the direction my own department, my own history department, should be going in the next few years, but also about trends in the field more generally, about the meaning of history as a discipline rather than as a metaphysical force, and also about the fate of the humanities under which we would, I think, subsume history. Many of you will remember the benighted and bumbling head of department in Kingsley Amis's novel Lucky Jim, who portentously answers his office phone, "History speaking." I can't claim to speak with the voice of history, but I do want to reflect today on some of the purposes of history as an academic discipline. Across the world, at least in the English-speaking parts of it with which I'm most familiar, there's a much-discussed crisis of the humanities. The motors of this current crisis, despite its local manifestations in different countries, are many and miscellaneous. Sharply declining enrollments in our classrooms, the controversial rise of massive open online courses, or MOOCs, the shifting boundaries between scientific and non-scientific disciplines, which can make humanistic studies seem to some, at least, quaint or even luxurious in the 21st century. There are also genuine concerns about employability among students and their parents. There are creeping ideologies of impact and relevance. Also, a similar creeping instrumentalism among administrators, not those in this room, obviously, and squeezes on public and private university revenues that inform all of these concerns and all of these pressures across the world. Battling these challenges from within and from without can sometimes feel like a struggle against the many-headed hydra, a Herculean and therefore possibly heroic task, but one that's also unremitting because every victory brings with it a new adversary. These challenges affect history as much as other humanities subjects. As Lynn Hunt notes in a forthcoming book, history is in crisis, and it's not just a crisis of university budgets. Although history is counted among the social sciences at my own university, its patterns of enrollments over time have until recently mirrored closely those subjects like English, French, or German, for example. Our comparative advantage as historians is, of course, perspective. We can see that there have been recurrent crises of the humanities and different uses of the language crisis over many years, at least the last 50 years, and that this one is in fact nothing new. One historian has also shown that some of the panic about shrinking class sizes is misplaced, at least in the US. If judged from the peak in the 1970s, it can indeed look like the bottom is falling out of the humanities in American higher education, with the Wall Street Journal, for example, recently reporting a drop of almost 50% in the proportion of US students majoring in humanities subjects, from 14% in 1966 to 7.6% in 2010. However, that decline appears less shocking if the baseline is 1945, not 1966. Then, that is in 1945, barely 10% of students majored in humanities subjects, and it was therefore the late 60s and 70s when enrollments boomed that appear to be the long-term anomaly. The experience of my own department recently has been that such declines are also eminently reversible. Unlike the other humanities fields at Harvard, our number of freshly declared concentrators, that's Harvard speak for majors, in 2013 was 50% up on the same figures for 2012, something I'm very proud of in my own department, even as declines continue to fall in the English department and the language departments. We increased ours by 50% this year. Deeper digging into these figures has also revealed a crucial gender dimension to the statistics. Much of the alleged flight of the humanities has in fact been the movement of women first into and then out of humanities subjects. The proportion of men taking humanities subjects, again, at least in the US, has barely changed since 1950. Whether those findings would hold true in quite the same way in Canada or in the United Kingdom, for instance, I don't know. But two things are clear at the moment. The humanities do perceive themselves to be embattled, and they are on the defensive against a variety of enemies throughout the English-speaking world. And their methods, particularly the long-term analytical perspectives afforded by history that I'll talk about today, can help to identify meaningful rather than misplaced causes for concern. What then might we do to snatch history from the bonfire of the humanities? History, understood as an inquiry into the past, has of course been pursued in various forms for over 2,000 years. And of course, inquiry is the very etymological meaning of the Greek word from which the term history and its analogues in other European languages derives. It therefore long preceded the very recent confining of such modes of understanding into professional disciplines and academic departments. And history, of course, has a very long pedigree within broadly classical systems of education from late antiquity to the 20th century. That's just speaking of the Latin West and its offshoots, of course, as Danny Wolfe in his own work and with his collaborators has shown there are much bigger global patterns in historiography as well. For much of that time, history, we might say, was a more or less practical pursuit, a guide to public life for rulers, their advisors, and for citizens, to provide philosophy teaching by examples, as one classic tag had it, or to be the guide to life, the magistra vitae, as Cicero famously put it. History deployed analysis of the past precisely to shape the future. It is only in the past century that history gradually lost its public, future-oriented mission, though there are signs that its vocation, in a more critical, democratic, even radical guise, may be returning. History's place in public life for the moment, however, remains fragile and uncertain, to the point that historians now occupy very little, if any, space in policy debates, whether national, international, or global. This retreat to the margins is, I believe, partly self-inflicted, partly the unintended consequence of professionalization over the last century, partly the result of more aggressive claims to public influence by other academics, especially by economists, of course. But the damage that's been done, I think, can still be undone. New directions in historical work can help to bring historians back into the marketplace of ideas where they belong, where we belong. History is broadening its horizons in space and expanding its horizons in time. Where once historians preferred the microscope, we're reaching again for the telescope. Landscapes as well as portraits are increasingly in the historian's repertoire. The long shot is once more joining the close-up as a major perspective on the past. I believe that no other form of humane inquiry is so well equipped to go wide and to go deep at the same time, and no other subject in the humanities, arguably perhaps no other academic discipline, has the capacity to be at once what I'll call transnational and transtemporal. Now let me explain briefly what I mean by those somewhat pretentious adjectives. Transnational is now, of course, a widespread term of art among historians and other scholars. It has a history going back at least to the mid-19th century, where its origins can be found in comparative philology. Then transnational study, or in German transnational study, meant looking for commonalities and connections between discrete national languages. Over the course of the 20th century, the word transnational has had to be repeatedly rediscovered and repurposed before settling into regular academic vocabulary. For example, international lawyers in the 1950s took it up as a word to cover new forms of law, for instance, the regulation of the environment or of outer space, that lay beyond state jurisdiction. And then, a generation later, humanists and social scientists found transnational useful again as a term in the last 20 years or so, as a term of art for all the ideas, processes and forms of activity, human and non-human, that do not fit comfortably within the political boundaries of nations or states. That's transnational. Transtemporal is a rather less frequently used word. I've appropriated, in fact, the term from anatomy, where it means formally, quotes, crossing the temples, traversing the temporal lobe of the brain. In the context of history, where I want to repurpose it for the moment, it implies crossing time periods and traversing the conventional segments, often quite short or quite narrow segments, into which we historians have conventionally sliced up the past. Just as transnational history stresses linkages and comparisons across space, so we might say that transtemporal history deals with such connections across time, especially long stretches of time. I'll give some more examples of this in a moment. But transtemporal history can already be found, for example, in the idea of various long centuries. The long 20th century, the long 18th century, even the long 13th century are all becoming popular terms among historians now. But this can also be found in the movement to erase the boundary between history and prehistory that's been led by my colleague Dan Smale, who I believe spoke here recently. And in other various species of long-range history, for example, big history, deep history, and the history of the Anthropocene, which I'll return to in a moment. transnational history rejects the national frame that structured so much historical writing since it became professionalized in the late 19th century. Transtemporal history, as it's beginning to emerge, revolts against conventional periodizations, especially those produced on the roughly biological timescales of, say, 5 to 50 years that have characterized most historical writing since the 1970s. The first, transnational history, I believe, captures the experiences of most of humanity more accurately than national history. The other presents a more radical path for history in the future, and a means perhaps to bring history back into some of the most pressing debates in the present. Debates about global governance, about inequality, and about the fate of the planet, for example. I'll return to that in my conclusion. The ability to be at once transnational and transtemporal may in fact be the key to history's evolutionary ability to survive academic catastrophe. As the editor of the American Historical Review recently noted, quotes, "To reflect in some manner on questions of scale in terms of both time and space is clearly not new, but there seems a degree of urgency as well as self-consciousness that informs our interest in this question today that was not present before. That urgency comes, I will argue, both from within and from outside the historical profession, but it is to the professional pressures that I'll now turn. History writing, as I think everyone here knows, became more than just the pursuit of interested amateurs in the late 19th century. It's from this moment on that we can speak of a historical profession. Like any new profession, it consciously equipped itself with all the paraphernalia of prestige and exclusivity, in this case journals, professional associations, systems of gatekeeping, and accreditation mechanisms like the PhD, all of which, of course, we still have with us today. More unwittingly, professional historians fitted their inquiries into those most readily available container for them, the nation state. Professional history, as we all know, was born national and stayed that way for most of the time across most of the globe until very recently. And this long-term commitment to what's been called methodological nationalism is distinctive of most of what we call professional history over the last century, as indeed of many other social sciences as well. And indeed, like most other social scientists, historians assume that self-identifying nations, organized politically into states, were the primary object of historical study. The main tasks for historians of these communities were, accordingly, to narrate how nation-states emerged, how they developed, and how they interacted with one another. Even those historians whose work deliberately crossed the boundaries of national histories worked along similar lines and reaffirmed those borders. For example, diplomatic historians used national archives to reconstruct relations among states. Historians of immigration, not emigration or diaspora, tracked the arrival and the assimilation of new peoples into existing states. And imperial historians tended to study empires as the extensions of national histories. In all these fields, the matter of history concerns stability, not mobility, what was fixed, but not what was mixed. But in the last 20 years, historians have increasingly questioned the usefulness of national frameworks for studying the past, moving towards studies they describe variously as international, transnational, comparative, and global. International historians often take for granted the existence of a society of states that look beyond state boundaries to map interstate relationships, from diplomacy and finance to migration and cultural exchanges. Transnational historians examine processes, movements, and institutions that overflow territorial boundaries. For example, the environment, organized crime, epidemics, corporations, religious institutions, and international social movements. Comparative historians deal with distinct historical subjects, which are often, but not always, nationally defined, in conjunction with each other, though not always on the basis of any actual direct historical connection between those objects of study. And global historians treat the history and the prehistories of globalization, the histories of objects that have become universalized on a global scale, and the links between sub-global arenas, such as the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. The family resemblance that links these approaches is the desire to go above or beyond the histories of states defined by nations and nations bounded by states. Most history, human and otherwise, however, took place in spaces larger than or smaller than the nation-state. To take account of this fact, we need to remove the nation-state shaped lenses to look at these broader trends and broader movements. This set of movements has encouraged historians to pay more attention to arenas that were larger than nations unconfined by the political boundaries of states, and connected by transnational linkages and circulations. If we take the long view, we might say that most of the world's population, for most of recorded history at least, lived not in nation states but in empires. For a relatively brief period, perhaps between the early 16th and the early 20th century, some of those empires were indeed the outgrowths of confidently national cultures, particularly in Europe and in Asia. They're not exclusively there, of course. But most were pre-national or supranational in composition. Oceanic spaces connected elements of many of these empires in the modern period, but maritime arenas such as the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific also segmented sovereignties and became cockpits of inter-imperial rivalry. In light of the long history of empire, the eternal world of states posited by modern conceptions of international relations, and indeed by the historical profession, might seem fleeting, even marginal. By some estimates, a world of true nation states, detached from empire, emerged only with the zenith of decolonization, soon to be swept away by the wave of transnationalism that erupted after the end of the Cold War. If that's true, that is, we only get nation states detached from empire about circa 1975, and then transnationalism comes sweeping in around 1989. The heyday of the nation state was about 14 years during my late teens and early 20s. I didn't notice it was happening at the time, but there it was at that point. All history before and after was either pre-national or post-national history. As Amitava kindly mentioned, my own work in recent years has tracked many of these developments in transnational history. My first book, The Ideological Origins of the British Empire, was on the history of empire and its relation to state formation in Britain and the Atlantic world from the mid-16th to the mid-18th century, and argued that the creation of the British Empire and the forging of the British state out of various nations, English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish among them, were not distinct but conjoined processes. The British state, I argued, emerged out of the experience of empire as much as the empire was an extension of the British state, and both were born amid international rivalries among European powers within Europe itself and also in the Americas. My next book, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, traced the emergence of a new state, or rather 13 new states, the United States of America in the plural, from the British Empire itself. In that book, I confronted a fundamental myth of American exceptionalism by showing how the US was born international and that the Declaration of Independence, that most American of American documents, was transnational in content, in form, and in impact across the 2 centuries and more since 1776. By focusing on one text and its transnational fortunes, I was able to begin answering the question, how did our modern world of states, the world we all inhabit now, emerge from an earlier world of empires? Most recently, and again that Amitava kindly mentioned, Foundations of Modern International Thought, I took that question further to ask, how did we, all in the world today, come to imagine that we inhabit a world of states? That's all of us except for stateless persons and the inhabitants of Antarctica, the penguins, who live in a frozen, literally frozen environment where sovereignty is frozen. There's no statehood over or in Antarctica. But everyone else, except the unfortunates in Guantanamo Bay or the other states of exception created as exceptions by states, inhabits a world of states where states claim territorial authority, we gain our rights, we gain our protections from them. There are very few exceptions to that. I believe that feat of collective human imagination blanketing the earth with statehood may be the single most important shift in political consciousness of the last 500 years, bigger than the expansion of democracy, the rise of popular sovereignty, the spread of nationalism, or the proliferation of human rights, for instance, because each of those other developments depended on the creation of a world of states for its unfolding. It was in the early modern period, roughly between the early 17th century and the early 19th century, that I argue the foundations of modern international thought were laid down. States, not individuals or corporate entities, became the primary actors in world affairs. These sovereign states operated under conditions of so-called anarchy, that is, self-organization without any controlling world government or other superior sovereign. Because states controlled who could and could not be recognized as a state, they created international organizations, such as the United Nations, to police the actions of member states of the club, with all others outside it deemed to be rogues, pirates, or failed states, for example. Ideology and myth sustained and continue to sustain this self-affirming international community, for example, through narratives such as the emergence of a so-called Westphalian state system, that allegedly began in 1648. The historian's task, I believe, at least this historian's task, has been to puncture some of these myths by asking where they came from, what motives lay behind them, and how they became so central to understanding the international realm in our current affairs. Each of these myths had to be invented. The world of states is not a feature of nature, self-evidently, but each arose for quite specific reasons, usually the defense of new or embattled institutions against their competitors and their adversaries. Most of the fundamental myths of international thought are surprisingly recent. For example, the idea that the international realm is Hobbesian comes from the 1920s. The myth of the Westphalian state goes back only to the early 19th century, not to the 17th century, and the very idea of the international emerged only in the 1780s when the term was coined by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Breaking these myths and realizing how fragile many of our presuppositions about international politics are can be salutary for questioning some of the assumptions of our political masters. For example, that the individual is necessarily subordinate to the state, that borders are impermeable, and therefore, for example, immigrants should be kept outside them, or that there's such a thing as a national interest, which trumps our duties of care for those beyond our frontiers, for example. And more generally, by seeing our own inherited arrangements on a global scale as accidental and contingent, the products of history, we may be in a better position to question them and also to imagine alternatives. That, I would suggest, is also a property of the more expansive transtemporal history that I'll sketch now. So let me turn to that now by drawing on some collaborative work that I'm engaged on at the moment with my colleague Joe Gouldy at Brown University, which is forthcoming as an article in Annals later this year or very beginning of next year, but also we're turning it into a short book modestly entitled The History Manifesto. We'll end with a Marxian exaltation in about 20 minutes, so we'll build up to that. As I've been sketching, transnational history has been a reaction against seeing the past through nation-shaped spectacles. Transtemporal history represents a revolt against the equally constraining timeframes within which most historical research and writing has been conducted for most of our lifetimes, at least most of the lifetimes of people in this room. Now, I alluded earlier to Kingsley Amis's Lucky Jim, and some of you may recall the academic article about which Jim Dixon, a nervous junior lecturer worried, as we've all been, about our academic future at the beginning of our careers, obsesses throughout the book. This article, which is going through the refereeing process, through the book, keeps coming back, and some of you, I think, will remember the title of that article, The Economic Influence of the Developments in Shipbuilding Techniques 1480 to 1485. It was a perfect title, the narrator notes, in that it crystallized the article's niggling mindlessness, its funereal parade of yawn-enforcing facts, the pseudo-light it threw upon non-problems. Yet within a few years of the novel's appearance in 1953, an essay on such an absurdly over-ambitious and broad topic, covering as many as 35 years of English history, would have been deemed almost recklessly over-ambitious for any young academic. For the best part of 2 generations, roughly from about 1975 to 2005, most historians conducted most of their studies on timescales of between 5 and at most 50 years. Thousands of historical monographs, articles, and dissertations testify to the constraint of biological timespans calibrated more or less, and usually less, to the length of a human life. In 1900, the average number of years covered in doctoral dissertations in history in the US was about 75 years. By 1975, it was closer to 30. Think of something like W.E.B. Du Bois's famous dissertation on the suppression of the African slave trade, which covered almost 3 centuries. Think of Frederick Jackson Turner's history of trading posts in Wisconsin, which went back to the beginnings of indigenous and settler contact all the way up to the 19th century. These were characteristic of the late 19th century in terms of the foundations of the historical discipline in that country. Only very recently, however, has the length of doctoral dissertation, the length covered by doctoral dissertations, rebounded to somewhere between about 75 and 100 years. The shibboleths of specialism could be found across the world. A command of archives, even as some might say a fetishism of archives. The more obscure, the better, of course. Total control over a massively exploding bibliography, and an imperative to reconstruct the past in ever finer detail by using the tools of microhistory and thick description forged by anthropologists before they found their way into the hands of historians. This contraction of temporal horizons represented a relatively rapid retreat from what in 1958 the great French historian Fernand Braudel had classically called the longue durée, or as we call it in English now, the longue durée. Braudel was already world famous for his magisterial study of the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II, one of the most influential historical works of the 20th and still into the 21st century. As you'll all remember, he organized the Mediterranean according to 3 different timescales, told in succession as the book unfolded. What he called a quasi-immobile history of human beings and their physical environment over geological epochs. Then a gently paced story of states, societies and civilizations over centuries, even millennia, and a more traditional histoire événementielle, treating what he called those brief, rapid, nervous oscillations, events. The allegedly unchanging landscape, patterns of urban settlement, the eternal regimes of agriculture, all these were aspects of the longue durée, as Braudel would term it 10 years later. His masterpiece, again as you probably remember, was mostly written while he was in German prison camps between 1940 and 1945. As he later admitted, his reflections on the longue durée were in part an attempt to escape the numbing daily rhythms of camp life and to bring hope by taking a longer perspective. Hence, paradoxically, his frequent use of the imagery of imprisonment in his accounts of the longue durée. He quite frequently talks about human beings being imprisoned within, encased, encaged within the longue durée. Must be a metaphorical substrate in his own experiences there. Braudel explicitly launched the term longue durée, however, in 1958, a term that he'd taken from 2 disciplines, I think. One is the study of, the sociological study of unemployment. The term recurs frequently, especially in the interwar years in French sociology, but also from medical history as well. A disease of longue durée is a disease that stays within either a population or a body for a long term, but he's the first to use it as a historical term in a classic article in Annales in 1958. When he launched the term then, he was battling a different enemy, an earlier product of what he called a general crisis of the human sciences. The nature of the crisis as he anatomized it was in some ways familiar to us now, an explosion of knowledge, including a proliferation of data, a general anxiety about disciplinary boundaries, a failure of cooperation between researchers in adjacent fields, and the stifling grip of what he called a retrograde and insidious humanism. Braudel lamented that the other human sciences had overlooked the distinctive contribution of history to solving this crisis, a solution that he believed went to the heart of the social reality that was the focus of all humane inquiry, what he called this opposition between the moment and slowly unfolding time. Between those 2 poles lay the conventional timescales used in narrative history and by social and economic historians, spans of 10, 20, 50 years at most, he argued. Histories of crises and cycles along these lines, he believed, obscure the deeper regularities and continuities underlying the process of change. It was essential, he argued, to move to a different temporal horizon, a history measured in hundreds, even thousands of years. History on what he called a long, sometimes very long duration, l'histoire du longue, même de très longue durée. Braudel's motives for promoting the longue durée were as much institutional as intellectual, however. He just assumed the editorship of Annales itself, and also the presidency of one of France's leading intellectuals institutions, the famous 16e section, the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. From those lofty pinnacles, he had to justify the primacy of history among other social sciences, especially against economics and anthropology. And in that competitive context, where prestige and funding were at stake as much as professional pride, Braudel offered the historian's longue durée as the alternative to mathematics, the alleged key to the human sciences, which linked it with the natural sciences, as precisely the way to integrate the human sciences together and to distinguish them from such fields as economics. Now, Braudel ranged the history of the event, l'histoire événementielle, against the longue durée, not because such history could only treat the ephemeral, what he famously called the spume and the fireflies of history, but because the history of events was too closely tied, especially to political and economic events in his own time. In this respect, he charged it was like the work of contemporary economists, who had harnessed their work to current affairs and to the short-term imperatives of governance. Such a myopic form of historical understanding, he went on, tethered to power and focused on the present, evaded explanation and was allergic to theory. In Brodel's view, it lacked both critical distance and intellectual substance. Now, this agenda, as he was pressing it forward, also dovetailed very neatly with the rise of futurology, that forward-looking counterpart to the longue durée, on both sides of the Atlantic in the aftermath of World War II. And there are very close institutional and personal connections between the forms of funding and the promoters of futurology, especially through the Rand Corporation in the 1950s, and Brodel and some of his associates as well. So the longue durée looking backwards, and futurology as a science, or perhaps a pseudoscience looking forwards, emerge out of the same matrix and often from some of the same funding bodies and some of the same transatlantic conversations. I think in this context it was no coincidence that the very term long range, which might be the English equivalent of longue durée, migrated first from ballistics, think of long range weapons, to futurology, think of long range weather forecasting, and from there to history, the longue durée. And that's just a brief sketch, but I think one can actually parse out those connections between weapons technology in the Second World War, the creation of new long-range sciences like weather forecasting and futurology, and then the emergence of the longue durée in the matrix of the emergent Cold War social sciences around the transatlantic arena in the 50s and 60s. Within barely 20 years of Brodel's famous article in 1958, however, across most of the historical profession globally, there was a general contraction of temporal horizons. As I've already mentioned, by 1975, the average time span covered by a doctoral dissertation in history in the United States was about 30 years. And around 1900, the birth of professional history again, it had been about a century. I've already mentioned some of the great foundational works of the historical profession, at least in the US, which took much longer timescales. But across the course of the 20th century, all of the newly professionalizing disciplines, humanistic and natural scientific, as they became more specialized, as knowledge expanded, as simple control over material, especially secondary materials or the materials of scholarship itself, became more and more anxiety-inducing, there was greater and greater anxiety in turn about the dangers of over-specialization. As one sign of that, we can note the explosion of uses of the phrase knowing more and more about less and less between the 1920s and 1940s. One can do a nice Google engram of that. The 1920s, that term is almost never used, and there's a huge explosion in the interwar period of anxiety about knowing more and more about less and less. In history, at least, I think it was only in the 1980s, roughly, that is after the retreat from the longue durée, that such worries became widespread in the professional community of historians. For example, in his 1981 presidential address to the American Historical Association, Bernard Bailyn observed that what he called the challenge of modern historiography was, quote, to bring order into large areas of history, and thus to reintroduce it to a wider reading public through synthetic works, narrative in structure on major themes, precisely because, he said, historical inquiries are ramifying in 100 different directions at once, and there is no coordination among them. Shortly afterwards, in 1987, and there are many, many more examples I could give of this, the then young British historian David Cannadine assailed what he called the cult of professionalism, that meant more and more academic historians were writing more and more academic history that fewer and fewer people were actually reading. The result, he said, was that all too often the role of the historian as public teacher was effectively destroyed. Professionalization, these major scholars believed, had led to marginalization. Historians were increasingly cut off from non-specialist readers as they talked only to one another about ever narrower topics, studied on ever shorter timescales. So someone like Jim Dixon, writing on 35 years of the shipbuilding industry and its influence, would have been brushed out of the profession as someone with mad horizons, completely unspecialized by that point. The explanations for this retreat from the public sphere and the fear of long-term history were many. I've already mentioned the turn towards thick description imported from anthropology, and also the rise of microhistory, with its concentration on specific events, peculiar individuals, and often intractable documents. Add to these some broader factors, that famous skepticism towards grand narratives that Jean-Francois Lyotard diagnosed and that famously defined postmodernism. The move of many adjacent disciplines, adjacent to history, from holism and synthesis to disaggregation and analysis. Think of the rise of microeconomics, for instance, or of analytic philosophy as well. And also a more general orientation towards the immediate, the present, the here and now. I'm sure we all recognize this in our own classrooms and the trends of our own departments, ever further towards the modern, the present, and our own national perspectives in some ways as well. All of these contributed to the centrifugal forces working against longer-term perspectives and the triumph of the short durée. This age of fracture, as the American intellectual historian Daniel Rogers has recently called it, was defined centrally by the contraction of temporal horizons. And I think this is actually the big story in terms of historiography. It's not the rise of the cultural turn or the social turn, for instance. I think they're symptomatic. Those terms, for instance, are symptomatic of a retreat to shorter and shorter timescales. In the middle of the 20th century, Dan Rogers has recently written, history's massive, inescapable, larger-than-life presence had weighed down social discourse. To talk seriously then was to talk of long, large-scale movements of time. However, by the 1980s, Rogers goes on, modernization theory, Marxism, quotes, theories of long-term economic development and cultural lag, the inexorabilities of the business cycle and the historian's longue durée had all been replaced by a foreshortened sense of time based on one brief moment, the here and now of the immediate present. The retreat to the short durée was not confined to social history or indeed to the American historical profession. At around the same time, in my own field of intellectual history, the Cambridge historian Quentin Skinner, for example, was leading a charge among intellectual historians against various long-range tendencies in the field, most notably Arthur Lovejoy's History of Ideas, which often stretched over thousands of years, and also the canonical approach to great books by which political theory had generally been taught. And Skinner and his acolytes, and I'm a student of Quentin Skinner, so I count myself partly among them, were campaigning in favour of ever tighter rhetorical and temporal contextualization in intellectual historical work. The contextualism of the so-called Cambridge School therefore focused almost exclusively on the synchronic and the short-term settings for arguments, treated as moves in precisely orchestrated language games or as specific speech acts, but not as instantiations of timeless or transtemporal ideas or enduring concepts. The contextualists' original enemies were Marx, Nania, and Lovejoy, but their efforts were often construed as an assault on anachronism, abstraction, and grand theory more generally. In 1985, Skinner himself tried to promote what he called the return of grand theory in the human sciences, but his enterprise was beset by the paradox that many of the thinkers who inspired or represented that revanche, among them, for example, Wittgenstein, Kuhn, and Foucault, expressed what he called a willingness to emphasize the local and the contingent, and a correspondingly strong dislike of all overarching theories and singular schemes of explanation. Reports of the return of grand theory in the 1980s were therefore somewhat exaggerated, as Mark Twain might have said. Far from returning, it seemed to be retreating into the twilight like the nervous owl. Now, of course, longue durée history never disappeared entirely from the publishing lists of university presses on both sides of the Atlantic. One can think, for example, of local community studies, especially by social historians in England or France, for instance, doing long-range reconstructions over centuries or sometimes thousands of years. However, the combination of archival mastery, microhistory, and an emphasis on contingency and context, powered by a suspicion of grand narratives, a hostility to Whiggish teleologies, and an ever-advancing anti-essentialism, determined an increasing focus on the synchronic and the short term. Questions of world history and of big history later widened the scope of narrative and began to incorporate an environmentally minded retelling of history in which human events were contextualized against the longer knife of natural processes. In more recent years, technological factors have also begun to change the possibilities for historical research, which make a return to the longue durée more practical and indeed perhaps imperative. Historians now have larger numbers of digitized electronic archives at our disposal, and we have more tools to analyze them. We're now, in some sense, the custodians of big data, and the methods of digital history can empower even junior scholars to attempt projects of a temporal scope and indeed a geographical scope undreamed of and often actively discouraged by historians in recent decades. And both of these factors have begun to drive historians to consider longer and longer time periods. In the last decade, evidence for a return to the longue durée can be found across the intellectual landscape, just to give a few examples now. For instance, a Latin Americanist has recently noted of his field that it became unfashionable to posit theories about historical trajectories over the very long run, but change was now in the air. Now the longue durée is back. A European cultural historian, Tom Lecoeur, tells his colleagues at a conference, all of us are invested more or less explicitly in a longue durée of sexuality. And a professor of American studies recently remarked of her discipline, anyone in literary studies who has looked recently at titles of books, conferences, research clusters, and even syllabi across the field cannot have missed two key words that are doing substantial periodizing duty for literary and cultural criticism. those two words being those of the chronological unit, the longue durée. Recent works have also placed the Cold War and migration, the Black Sea and the Arab Spring, women's spirituality and the history of Austria, German Orientalism and concepts of empire, and many other examples into the context of the longue durée. And even a cursory scan of new arrivals on the history bookshelves turns up a host of long-range histories of around-the-world travel over 500 years, of the first 3,000 years of Christianity, of strategy from chimpanzees to the present, of genocide from Sparta to Darfur, and of guerrilla warfare from ancient times to the present, of the very shape of human history over the last 15,000 years, and a host of similar grand topics directed by historians to wider reading publics. My own current research on the history of ideas of civil war spans over 2,000 years, from Rome to the present. At one point I planned to end with Iraq, but now Syria seems a more likely finishing point. It was going to be from Caesar to al-Sada, it's now from Sulla to Syria. I hope nothing else comes up in the meantime before I finish the book to disrupt that. My aim is to show how contemporary definitions of civil war, that is, present-day definitions of civil war, necessarily breed conflict about conflict because they embody a confused and often contested set of conceptions whose roots in some cases go back to Roman law, to Roman oratory, to Roman history, to Roman poetry. Civil war resists definition because it's both evaluative and descriptive as a term. It cannot be abstracted, despite many distinguished attempts, especially by social scientists, to do so, but I believe it must be historicized. It's also an indispensable item in our political vocabulary, yet one whose application to events is never without controversy. This is in part because the term civil war occurs in both technical discourses and in non-expert speech. As any one of us might think, we know what civil war is when we see it or have it reported to us, but there are multiple communities of experts, such as international lawyers, political scientists, and politicians themselves, who may beg to differ. Think of the debates over whether or not the violence in Iraq rose to the level of civil war in 2005-2006. And think of the recent debates also about whether or not the death toll in Syria approximated to the condition of civil war. A condition about a year ago, just over a year ago, that was fraught with anxiety for Syrians themselves, who knew and were saying frequently through the international and national media that they knew they were in a civil war, but it took nearly 6 months for the International Committee of the Red Cross to certify that indeed there was a civil war going on in Syria. This was of immense importance because only when international certification kicks in do certain international humanitarian laws and also protocols of the Geneva Conventions kick in relation to a conflict. So it does matter enormously to the lives of tens of thousands of people whether or not this term is used and under what conditions. Civil war, I'm arguing, has always been, since its very origins in Republican Rome, has always been an essentially contested concept and cannot be precisely defined or contained. It's therefore, I believe, a prime suspect for long-range intellectual history of the kind I'm attempting, which aims at unsettling the certainties of policymakers and journalists by adding complexity and historical depth to current debates. But it's only one such object. A host of other trans-temporal, longue durée intellectual histories have been emerging now of occupation and empire, of genius, of common sense and public choice, of democracy, of ambition and obedience, among others. At least one historical field, intellectual history, is overcoming its resistance of longue durée, and others are already following. Indeed, big is back across a spectrum of new and revived modes of historical writing. Grandest of all is big history, an account of the past stretching back to the origins of the universe itself. Somewhat more modest in scope, because it includes only the human past, is the still remarkably expensive deep history, again pioneered by my colleague Dan Smale, spanning some 40,000 years, which deliberately breaks through the entrenched boundary between history and prehistory. And more focused still, yet with perhaps the most immediate resonance for present concerns, is the history of the Anthropocene, the roughly 200-year period in which human beings have comprised a collected actor, powerful enough to affect the environment on a planetary scale, as Dipesh Chakrabarty, who I believe was here recently speaking about this, has argued very powerfully in his recent works. The timescales of these movements, big history, deep history, the history of the Anthropocene, are respectively cosmological, archaeological, and climatological. Each represents a novel expansion of historical perspectives, and each operates on horizons longer, usually much longer than a generation, a human lifespan, or the other roughly biological timelines that have defined most recent historical writing. The longer perspectives afforded by this new, enlarged view of history have obvious relevance, I believe, to our current situation. Since the Second World War, planning horizons and budget cycles around the globe have shrunk ever more drastically, even more drastically than the timescales of historians. Electoral cycles and models drawn originally from military strategy and economic forecasting narrowed the focus of policymakers, NGOs, and politicians, as well as businessmen, of course, to periods of between 1 and 5 years. It's little wonder then that global governance is in collapse. Inequality within countries is rising, even as inequalities between them are declining, or that climate change is almost certainly beyond human remedy, as the IPCC has reported just this week, because we're operating on these very, very foreshortened timescales, which are wholly inadequate to considering either the roots or potentially the solutions to these pressing global problems. All these crises, of course, have deep roots, stretching back at a minimum to the mid-20th century in the rise of modern international institutions, the late 19th century in the acceleration of capitalism, or the late 18th century in the beginnings of the Anthropocene, respectively. However, history is not, as economists might tell us, reducible simply to past dependency. The future need not run in advance of the past. It is possible to jump tracks, to take new directions, just as it's feasible to go back through the past to discover paths not taken. Only by scaling our inquiries over many decades, centuries, or even millennia can we hope to understand the genesis of our present discontents. And only by delving deep into the past can we hope to project ourselves imaginatively any meaningful distance into the future. As my avatar Winston Churchill once said, the longer you can look back, the further you can look forward. For these reasons, I believe the future of the past is in the hands of historians. It's in your hands, our hands. Armed with both the transnational and the transtemporal perspectives, historians can be guardians against parochial perspectives and endemic short-termism. Once called upon to offer their advice on political development and land reform, the creation of the welfare state and post-conflict settlement, historians, along with other humanists, effectively ceded the public arena, nationally as well as globally, to the economists and occasionally to lawyers and political scientists. When was the last time, for example, you saw a historian writing a regular column in the New York Times, or being seconded to the White House from their academic post, let alone consulting for the World Bank, or advising the UN Secretary General? These things happened in the early part of the 20th century, up to the 1950s and 60s, but not in the last two generations. Perhaps little wonder then, again, that we have a crisis of global governance, that we're all at the mercy of unregulated financial markets, or that anthropogenic climate change threatens our seas and cities, our food supplies and water sources, our political stability, and even perhaps the survival of the species, to mention just a few foreseeable but increasingly unavoidable consequences. To put those challenges in perspective, and to combat the short-termism of our times, we urgently need the wide-angle, long-range views only historians can provide. Historians of the world, unite. There is a world to win before it's too late.
You have time for questions.
Thanks very much for a really interesting, thought-provoking presentation. One question I have is if you could perhaps refine a little bit what you think the methodological value or approach of transtemporal kinds of conceptualizations of history might be, and how one can distinguish those from the sorts of things that the microhistory and the contingency has been resisting, which is essentializing in trans-historical. That's you're suggesting let's opt for trans-temporal history. A lot of people may say that a lot of the work that's being done under this new sign of broader historical periodization is often just trans-historical, and that was a negative. So
Yes.
how would you kind of maybe refine what you're talking about in that?
Yeah, and thank you for that clarification. I deliberately avoided the term trans-historical because that does have a negative valence to it, to talk about the trans-temporal, something which links together, sutures together, takes the fruits of specific historical periodizations and specialized studies into longer narratives. So it's not, in any sense, replacing or marginalizing detailed historical studies, but it's asking us to return to the why question. Why do we do these more focused studies in the first place? I always say to my own graduate students, even as they're doing their own archivally based projects, often within particular historical boundaries, what's the biggest question you can answer with your specific topic? Pull out the focus, talk to other historians, even beyond historians, by saying, why does this matter? So what? What's at stake here? And you mentioned microhistory in relation to this. If you think about the origins of microhistory in the 1960s, especially among Italian historians, their major aim was precisely to use detailed archival investigation to test long-term hypotheses and larger scale processes, not to avoid them, but to test them with the rigor of archival research and hermeneutic specificity. So microhistory in its origins, its Italian and French origins in particular, was not ranged against the longue durée. It was articulated with the longue durée. It's only recently, especially in the Anglophone sphere, that microhistory has pulled away from the longue durée and forgotten its original purpose as a kind of testing or assaying of longer-term generalizations, especially in the Italian context, within a Marxist historiography, for instance, to test those larger questions. So that's the kind of approach I would recommend, is to for anyone doing a microhistory to ask themselves and to articulate to others, what is the macro history that this is an instantiation of? What's the larger question which lies behind this, rather than simple fascination with, or perhaps fetishism of, the cranky, the weird, the wacky, the rebarbative story that one digs up in the archives, which has become the basis of the genre now. You come across a really crazy anecdote in a legal archive and you think, fame and fortune, I can send this to a trade publisher, like a 150-page book, and become famous. One of my colleagues used to teach a course on microhistory, Carlo Ginzburg, Bob Darnton, Natalie Zeman-Davis, which the official title, he said, was Microhistory. He said the unofficial title was Little Books, Big Histories. Big salaries. Little Books, Big Salaries. Some of you may recognize the impersonation of who that was. I won't blow the whistle on him. But that sense that microhistory in the Anglosphere had lost its intellectual purpose, had become an object of fascination and fetishism rather than a contribution to the testing of or the construction of longer-term perspectives, I think was a radical uncoupling from the original meaning, the original purpose of microhistory in that way. So it's partly recalling the necessity of doing that. And then in my own work, just to come to a more concrete answer to your question, what I'm attempting to do is what I'm calling serial contextualism. That is to string together, in my own account of the history of ideas of civil war, not the history of a trans-historical concept, which was somehow born in Republican Rome and then has a life of its own, a biography of its own, independent of the periods of contestation and argument within which it appeared. And I'm trying to reconstruct the moments of contestation, the moments of argument, which in this particular case are often very self-consciously related to previous moments through historical memory. Let's say roughly everyone up to the late 18th century, when they talk about civil war, remembers the narrative of the Roman civil wars, which is then overlaid upon narratives of what they call civil wars, or sometimes rebellions, or sometimes revolutions, increasingly in their own national spaces. But there's that layering of historical memory which allows one to reconstruct a trans-temporal narrative, because that was present to actors themselves. That trans-temporal dimension was an actor's category in relation to this set of concepts, and then later on, as it enters legal discourse, you get the sedimentation of precedent, which allows that going back through time, and then as one gets to the later 20th century, the embedding of conceptions of civil war, definitions of civil war in the social sciences, and their transmission through professional institutions, professional literatures, means again you have continuities, self-conscious continuities layering upon each other. So I picked that example partly because it's about repeated contestation which is never concluded, but it's also sutured together into a longer narrative because of this thinking backwards through the mechanisms of professional literature, through precedent in law, and then through historical memory. So that's the kind of procedure I'm using to do this serial contextualization, not of something trans-historical, but reconstructed in this trans-temporal fashion, which would not be possible if one were just taking one slice in the 16th century, the 1st century BCE, in the 16th century, and the 20th century. But it's essential to see the whole span to understand why we're so confused about it and where those confusions came from. Please.
I'm not a historian, I'm a posture here, so my field is English literature, but I guess I'd just like to say that I appreciate your comments and they are really very interesting, but I've also been thinking of it in my, maybe get more about a horizontal spread to microhistory, because if I'm trying to work on 17th century literature, and I know you know this kind of thing, right? Then it's really helpful for me to know Natalie Davis, because I can point students to that, and we can talk about microhistories. So in this horizontal way out to maybe philosophy and literature and other humanities much more easily than a long view, and that's not going to help when you're looking at 15th century poetry and so on. So I just wanted to point that out. That
it's really not going to help. You sure it's not going to help?
Well, I think it's not as helpful as a microhistory. I'm not saying nobody should read that, but I guess I'm thinking, if you think about humanities as a bigger discipline, as a sort of mega discipline or whatever, then there is something to be said for historians. Historians provide a lot of, they do work that we don't do in literature. They provide a lot of material that I'm not doing myself. So I'm not against the longer, I'm just pointing out the value there for other disciplines. Depending on how micro it is, okay? And, obviously.
But literature is the discipline which was invested for the longest time in the idea of tradition and transmission. And the necessity of knowing traditions in order to understand even the very basics of the literature. I was trained in English literature myself, but I defected to history, so I'm the imposter here. Not you.
Well, and I teach the second year course, which is a foundational grand narrative, starting from, I go back into European, okay, so we end up now with pretty much 20s, really not so much, we end up with the contemporary. So I'm not against that, it's just that, I find still when you're trying to, for instance, I will just quickly mention this, I don't know if you know this TV series called Tudor Monastery Farm, but it is an excellent resource because it is an attempt to recreate life in 1500, and if somebody really wants a better sense of what that might be like, that is better than a lot of vaguer notions that people have developed from our culture about what a monastery might be like. Because there's a far better thing to spend just 1 hour watching one episode of people preparing food on that show, I would say, as background to a lot of English literature.
One skeptical historian has called that kind of approach, and also more micro-historical approach, sentimentalist. That we're appealing to the idea of trans-historical empathy with the past. We're not actually thinking about the long-range history of institutions, such as monasteries and other similar religious institutions across time. And to take a slice where we think, they were eating their beef and carrots, and we eat our beef and carrots, and therefore we're just the same.
Okay, I have to just one. We were talking about Robin Hood. In Robin Hood stories, again, Robin Hood over time, really it's a long story or legend that develops over. In the earliest versions, he kills monks. And people often are sort of surprised by this. But if you get a sense of what it might have been like to live in a class system in which the monks were the overlords and the wealthiest people, then you start to understand that Robin Hood, and you start to look at what happens to Robin Hood later on in the early modern period, and he becomes sentimentalized. So I'm not sure that I don't buy the idea that everything it doesn't have to be all about them being like us. It's actually often a bit of a shock. They're not. So, sorry.
Tudor Monastery Farm?
It's called Tudor Monastery
Is it on Netflix?
It's very material. It's like material, really material.
Thank you.
Okay, actually, one of the points you mentioned about futurology, I thought was really interesting. It made me think of an interview I read recently with Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore. And what I thought was really interesting about this interview is he was using history to kind of forecast, how political and economic developments were going to play out in the Pacific in the next 40 years. And so anyways, I was thinking about that, and you started talking about marginalization of history, and I was wondering, would history benefit from maybe emphasizing like futurology? Somewhat like, do you think they should include this in schools? Is this something that should be focused on more in history? I'm just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel. I'm grasping for the name of the book, or the name of the author of the book. It's a recent book by a trade historian who, in the bad job market of the 1980s, didn't get a position but moved into things like the Rand Corporation, using his historical skills to make scenario forecasting more rigorous. And he has a very, very challenging argument in the book, which argues that the future does not exist, but nor does the past. The past only exists in our reconstruction of it. The future only exists in our reconstruction of it. The methods for reconstructing the past can be used to reconstruct potential futures. We don't know which one it is of the many that might be available, but it has to be constrained by evidence, it has to be constrained by plausibility, it has to be constrained by causality, etc., etc., etc. So one can narrow down the range of possible futures that, for instance, one might give to a corporation in trying to imagine 20 or 40 years out. In parallel ways to the way in which we construct the past out of inadequate evidence. The shipwreck of the past throws up only fragments upon the shore from which we can reconstruct the past. We don't have all of the available evidence to reconstruct all of the past, but we reconstruct multiple pasts as historians. That's what we do as an implicit counterfactual to every account that we all make as historians in our own work. We're all competing with each other for different reconstructions of different pasts, long or short, wide or narrow, as historians. So actually, the difference between the future and the past may not be as great as we imagine it. The past does not exist, except in our reconstruction of it. I'm a Collingwoodian skeptic to that extent. It has no independent existence apart from how we reconstruct it in the present. That the same can be said of the future. So with that in mind, we might think about the ways in which the future can be not projected along tram rails from the present, but think about how we reconstruct the future from available evidence with canons of plausibility, inclusion and exclusion, to reconstruct that, but to do that in the knowledge of the past, but to do that not the past in the last 1 year or 5 years, but over the lifespan of institutions or traditions, some of which go back 50 years, some of which go back 2,000 years, or much longer than that, and then in the context of the environment, to go back hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years in that way, in order then to project into the future. And this is where the Anthropocene in particular is a very interesting category. As you know, it's been proposed as a geological term of art for a geological periodization, but so far it's not been approved by the standard body of geologists, because it has, well, for two reasons. One, because it's so short, goes back roughly to the late 18th century and roughly to the origins of the Industrial Revolution, but also the major objection is because it projects into the future. It's the only geological era which has future built into it. What we have done to the planet, what we have done to the air, how we leach chemicals into the physical environment has long-term consequences of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, millions of years in that way. So it has a futurological element built into it. These new kinds of periodization which link the past to the future and show the consequences of the present for the future, as well as the past sedimented into the present for the future, I think are something that we as historians have to start thinking about to imagine how we articulate those dimensions and not assume that the future is something over which we have no control or have no interest. I think we do have an interest, and we do have some skills as historians for thinking about the reconstruction of multiple futures, not one single future, but multiple futures. Please.
It was a great talk, and I just was hoping you could talk a bit more about our role as sort of transnational global historians. So you have this great, hypothetically, so one would have this great global or transnational project, but then you would go and present that at, say, the American Historical Association or the Canadian Historical Association. You'd apply for a national grant. So how much are we still national historians?
Well, it depends how constraining your funding bodies are. Whether in Canada they say the same things they do in, for instance, where one of the lines on every grant application is, how does this fit with the national interest, or the national security interest? And you have to define it very, very specifically in those terms. I think we have to push back against that and say, no national interest can be detached from international or global interests, especially for the most fundamental questions and problems that we face, even those that might seem to be nationally specific, relations with First Nations peoples or with indigenous peoples in Australia. These are parts of larger problems which link together Anglophone common law settler societies. They're not peculiar or specific only to one form of nationally bounded society. They do have international and national ramifications as well. We have to keep pushing back against that in good faith, even though it might not be the most wise strategy for focusing on the those national funding. But is that true in Canada? You have to answer those similar sorts of questions.
Yeah, it's Canada's place in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's Canada's place in the world.
Interesting. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, that's a bit more open-minded than the Australian version. Yeah. Please.
I have a question. I'm not quite sure how to formulate this, but it's about, I guess it's about manifestoism, if I might put it this way, which is declaring that we should abandon something and strike out on a new or re-emphasize a traditional course. I guess, and I guess related to that is actually a question about what I might call the return of the repressed that tends to raise questions about manifestoism. Because I think the issue, I guess, is sort of this. I mean, in listening to the talk, which I thought was really interesting, when you talk about the kind of emergence of the longue durée in Riddell, that your interpretation or your explanation of Riddell is not in terms of a longue durée. I mean, it's actually very kind of national, state specific, very local to Riddell himself. And in some ways, I thought that was kind of the most interesting thing, as opposed to saying longue durée is like universal history of the 18th century or whatever. And then when you kind of concluded and talked about serial contextualism, that isn't that just a series of the traditional studies? In other words, this I kind of wonder, like things like the so-called Declaration of Cultural History and other things. What you see is social history reappearing in a different form with certain different themes emphasized, but nonetheless. So I guess my question is there really, I mean, aside from issues of whether global history is kind of doable in some sense, is this really that much of a break with the past? Yeah.
Well, no, partly what my co-author and I are trying to do is to say this is precisely a return of longue durée, something that went away but never completely went away, but has, I think there's plenty of evidence that it's come back after a period when it was sidelined or discouraged. And it's to give encouragement to that larger movement, not to say this is something completely new or that we should be abandoning what everyone has been doing before, that this should be compatible with the most rigorous hermeneutic standards of scholarship, which we identify as the perhaps the key branding of history as against other social science disciplines, or often in relation to other humanities disciplines. There's something peculiar that we do, but we're very bad actually generally as historians at explaining what it is that we do that no one else can do, that an economist can't do better, or that a political scientist can't do better, or that a literary scholar cannot do better. We're not very good at explaining what it is that we do. One of the things we have done, I think we would say, better than those who do serial data reconstruction in political science, for instance, is to articulate that sense of agency and structure and immediacy in microhistory with the macro-historical scale. But we've often divided into the historians who do the micro, and then we've left it to journalists or to other non-accredited historians to write the long-range histories, often not to the standards that we would recognize. We tend to ignore those, but there is a discernible movement in the last 5 to 10 years of more historians going back to broader narratives, which are nonetheless narratives often based around, often reconstructing complexity, noting rupture. We've all learned our Foucauldian lesson about discontinuity as well as continuity. And what we're trying to do is to pinpoint that movement and to give encouragement to it, but also to say that this is likely to become something which is more feasible and also more imperative because of the availability of large amounts of historical data, which now we can use. We can analyze using especially digital tools over the longue durée, which was not available in the 1970s or 80s, and it was actually necessary to discourage graduate students from doing very long-range topics because they would never emerge from the archive, they never get funding, and so on and so forth. But now there are ways of doing history which are compatible with the highest standards of historical research as we understand them distinctively for our discipline, which are nonetheless compatible with the reconstruction of longer-term institutions, the lifetimes of traditions, over longer periods, in order to understand origins, turning points, ruptures, discontinuities, as well as implied continuities over time as well. So that's the broader picture. It's not to say this is something new that no one's doing and that we should all be doing, and we should put down our tools and move off into another industry, as it were. I'd say lots and lots of people are already doing this, in many different fields, but they haven't necessarily noticed that other people are doing this. What are the common features? And then how does this relate to some of the changing technologies and archives, in the very broad sense of archive, as well as the tools that we now have as historians going forward for the next generation, which are likely to change historical practice, and likely to change historical practice in ways that can help us to fight against our deans, to fight against our funders, to justify our place within the university, but also to justify our place within larger public culture, from which largely we have ceded the days when R.H. Tawney could be sent to China to talk about land reform, when a diplomatic historian like Charles Webster in 1919 could be commissioned to write a history of the Congress of Vienna as a handbook for the peacemakers at their side. These moments are long past and seem very distant to us, but there may be the time for historians to come back into the public sphere with our peculiar hermeneutic tools, again articulated along these longer timescales. Dinesh Chakrabarty is a great example of this. Hugely sophisticated historical thinker who can say, pull out the focus, look at these different elements, combine these different literatures with an historian's sensitivity to complexity and change and rupture, in order to make the claim that we have a vision of climate change's relation to the planet and human history in relation to that, which no other discipline can command. That seems to be a key example of this, how this kind of work can change our views as humanists, but also reconnect humanists to a larger public sphere in relation to these bigger, maybe intractable problems, maybe reversible problems, but at least we can conceptualize the problems and shape our understanding of them better with a historical consciousness than perhaps many other fields can do. And also, just in conclusion, look at biology, look at climate science, look at so many other fields which are taking an historical turn themselves, even now, genetics, often increasingly in concert with historians, but we need to be making our claim with the natural sciences, not against them, to say, you're thinking historically, we've been doing this as a profession for 100 years, let's maybe team up and talk about what it is that we do as historians that can help you to think historically about the materials that you're dealing with as a climate scientist or as a geneticist or as a physicist, for instance.
It sounds like in some ways returning history some efficacy in the public sphere means rehabilitating either history's ability to say that things are always the same, or its predictive ability about how things, what things will be like in the future. And you think this will do that? I mean,
not necessarily predictive, and certainly not saying that things are always the same. As we all know, every history department should have inscribed over its doorway, it's all very complicated.
that's what we always say.
Exactly, precisely. We will say
everyone again is always the same.
All very complicated. Yeah. But to define in what ways it's complicated and what historical dimensions, transtemporal and transnational dimensions, I think we need to do a better job of self-advocacy to convince others why to say it's all very complicated isn't just throwing sand in the eyes of our colleagues, but actually is the key to what we do. It complicated in what ways? We need to be clear about defining that, I think. Just behind Harold here.
I was wondering whether you think that part of the problem is the structure of the PhD. And the way we have fields.
very, very practical questions which relate to the really important imperatives of what we do as historians. PhD funding, say, between 3 and 5 years, depending on which system you're in, radically constrains in some ways what you are able to do, obviously. However, certainly in my own department, for instance, where we have 5 years funding for the PhD rather than 3 years funding, we often try to admit students who already have languages and can learn more languages during the course of the PhD in order then to do multi-archival work, sometimes on 3 or 4 continents. It is feasible within the context of a PhD to do that, but not to sacrifice the depth, the complexity that we value most about our craft as historians. I still think that's possible, and also, again, the kind of claim that particularly my co-author as a digital historian is making is that certainly in the age of the archive, when it was necessary physically to go to an obscure archive and spend one's time there to produce a PhD, yes, it was constrained. You had relatively little time, you had relatively little funding, you had to show command of the archive itself. Now the archive is on your desktop. Now that every word published in English between 1450 and 1900, most words published in French from the early modern to the modern period, etc., are available on one's desktop. There are forms of historical research with vast archives, with the tools available to analyze them, that can be done even by, perhaps especially by, younger PhD students. And it's now, I think, not necessary to discourage graduate students from doing long-range topics. I think every one of my graduate students is doing a topic somewhere between 50 and 150 years now. And I think that is feasible, and I think it's also necessary. And it's important to push against some of the constraints that were imposed in the era of reduced resources and focus on microhistory and definitive archival mastery, to say no, the big questions are the ones that matter, or the very least, again, what's the biggest question that you can answer with your archival mastery within a more specific topic. That's very important, I think. Thank you.
Yeah. This is something that I'm trying to wrestle with in the question of how historians can, in a sense, speak in the larger public discourse, political discourse, and so forth. There seems to be a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, history writing is that writing is the most accessible of all academic writings, or at least we hope it is. So that doesn't go with the marginalization. And I've never understood this except when I think about some of the other fields, like the economists, the political scientists, who somehow have been able to leverage, particularly the economists, this belief that they sort of have a magical discipline that knows secrets that other people can't know, and therefore gives them the ability to be these sages that can sort of give the answer. While historians, because we're so accessible, everybody thinks they can do history, and so you get these endless idiot pundits all talking about Munich and the Sudetenland and thinking that they know something about the predictive power of history when they're talking about what Putin is doing and you get this sort of, everyone thinks they can do history, and therefore we get sort of when a historian talks, well, what's different from you? So how can we participate in this world of public discourse? In some ways, the very accessibility of our field works against us.
Yeah, perhaps we need to fake more mathematics. Just listening to a marvelous podcast interview with Mark Blythe, the economist and historian at Brown, I think, who's written this book on the history of austerity, the idea of austerity. He's asked exactly this question: why have the economists seized the public sphere? And he says precisely this: because they have mathematics on their side. They write 25-page papers that begin by saying, here's a policy-ready question. There's 23 pages of mathematics that no one understands, and then there's a final paper and there's a solution. And the civil servant or bureaucrat or politician who gets the paper thinks, oh, this must be real because there's all this mathematics I don't understand. And there's this microwave-ready solution at the end that I can run away with and put into policy. And he said, well, people like historians and anthropologists and sociologists, they write real prose, but they're writing for each other, and Professor X says Y, and Professor Z says Q, and Professor B and policymakers fallen asleep and then they get through and they don't understand the subject any better than they did at the very beginning, which was so special. We make no attempt to produce anything which is either seems authoritative in terms of recognizable in the corridors of power, nor do we produce anything which gives solutions except to say it's all very complicated. That's not what a bureaucrat wants to hear. They want to hear it's all very simple. And here is the simple solution, or here are 3 potential simple solutions that you may have. I mean, in greater seriousness, there's a group, for example, called the History and Policy Network in Britain. You may have come across some of their work that's been going for at least a dozen years, and they produce excellent historical papers on things like the history of pensions policy, the history of treatment of elders in care, or whatever it may be, going back within the history of institutions, often within the national framework specifically, but sometimes comparatively as well. And these papers are, say, between 10 and 15 pages long, so they're digestible, but each one has an executive summary at the beginning. If we just learn, if we taught graduate students in our historiography seminars, how do you produce an executive summary of your paper? Something that can be not reduced, but abbreviated into 3 or 4 bullet points at the very beginning, just to say, okay, what are the major takeaways of this piece? Something just as basic and technical as that can actually increase massively the potential for uptake, because anyone in any bureaucratic or policy position will tell you, you've got documents coming across your desk all the time. You need something which is 1 page, which gives you visible detail on what it is this thing is going to say, and it has to catch your eye before you then dig down into the detail and the complexity of the argument to be persuaded, to review the evidence. But you want to know where's the beef, what's the takeaway, so what? We never do this as historians. We almost never do this. Where's the thesis statement? I ask my students, page 6, page 8, come on, where's the thesis statement? What is this actually about? What are you arguing here? We're just very badly trained for that. And I think flipping that around, not to be purely handmaidens or instruments for power. Obviously, we want our major claim is that we should see history as a critical social science. It's not something to say the past has always been like the present, or to give reassurance to policymakers, but to say in a more pointed way, it's all very complicated. And here are 3 reasons why this particular topic is complicated, in order that you should change the questions that you're posing rather than necessarily giving the answers, but doing that in a way which is digestible, comprehensible, and actionable is something that we almost never think about as historians. And that's one of the reasons why people don't listen to us. But we do have, you're absolutely right, we have very much on our side narrative. We have narrative that includes humans and human motivation in many histories, though many of the histories we might want to tell are those that are pre-human or superhuman or post-human as well. So the model, the classic model of the 19th century realist novel, which is basically the model of most of what we do as historians of the narrative framework at its roots, isn't the only model. And it's not one that the economists adopt, it's not one that lawyers adopt. It is the one that gets them into the corridors of power. So we may need to examine our default attachment to 19th century realist narrative fiction as the basic structure for historical narration. Makes us accessible, but it also makes us marginal. So maybe not a paradox, but an oxymoron at the very heart of our practice as historians, our default practice anyway.
I'm curious about the connection you made between critique of Whiggish history and short-termism. It's also true that a critic of Whiggish history fueled the transnational, transtemporal histories as well. So I wonder, what is it in short-termism and transtemporal histories that tie them together pose a bit of Whiggish history? That's one question. The other is, when I'm listening to you and reading your work, and when you were speaking about transtemporal history, and sympathetically talking about deep history, do I sense a critic of big history, or am I misreading?
Yeah, just to take the latter first, I wouldn't say I'm a critic of big history in the sense that I have invested an enormous amount of time digging through all the works of big historians, but I think that part of the problem with big history, which has been attacked by some big historians for saying this, is that it makes the human dimension such a very, very small part of what we do as historians. The founder of Big History, David Christian, has a line quoted from Mark Twain somewhere about human history being like the skin of paint on the Eiffel Tower, a very, very short period. And I think for most of our students and most of our potential readers, to make the human dimension such a minor part of history is breaking that bond of empathy, which we still may have on our side, I think in terms of how history can communicate and how it can relate to that. But the fact that I'm not aware, for instance, that David Christian's been trained as a cosmologist. We would all be suspicious of moving purely synthetically into fields that may be cosmologists who are now moving into alliance, in fact, moving into alliances with historians, but a little suspicious of that very, very, very deep history in that sense. So I'd say suspicious rather than critical. I'm not going to say I have the tools to be critical. On the first one, I mean, I think I would say, I nuance very slightly what you asked to say that there may have been a process of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That is, that to talk about long-term histories or longue durée histories does not necessarily mean writing in or thinking about a progressivist mode, a teleological mode, a Whiggish mode. So the reaction against Whig history was the idea that, of course, the past leads up to the present, that it's continuity, it's progressive continuity, it's the story of how we became so wonderful, depending how far back you need to track that. That's the reaction against Whiggism in a very broadest sense. And we're still allergic to that, I think, as historians. That's very much in our DNA as a historical profession, to be anti-teleological, anti-Whiggist, and therefore, it seems therefore, to be against long-range narrative, because that must be branded as teleological and progressive. I don't think that's necessarily the case. There can be apprehensions of rupture and discontinuity. There are certainly suggestions, for instance, my colleague Vince Brown, whose work I think you know very well, suggests at the end of his marvelous book on Jamaica in the 18th and 19th centuries that we should be telling stories of oppression and inequality and human degradation. That's one of the reasons to write the histories of slavery. Why is there so much inequality and deprivation and human degradation in the world now? Because that too has historical roots in the same way that democracy or human rights or enlightenment or other more progressive forces do. We can tell histories that go deep into the past which are not progressive at all, which are in fact about the regressiveness of human history in that way. So there's no necessary connection between progress teleology and long-range narrative. I think the uncoupling of those is very important. There's a side issue that I'll talk about more length about, but we've also been inoculated against present. That's one of our key defining features as historians. I think we need to revisit that and ask, again, in epistemological terms, can we reconstruct the past except in the present? Shouldn't we take the admonitions of Crochet and others that all history is contemporary history, that is, all of our concerns are driven, consciously or unconsciously, by our own current concerns? Those might be the current concerns of our profession. Those might be very narrow, constricted concerns, but they come from within the boundaries of historical scholarship itself. But also, we may need to acknowledge that presentism can be a good thing, it can be necessary, but by inoculating ourselves against it professionally for decades, that's contributed to our marginalization in the public sphere and made us on the defensive against those disciplines which have been offered to the present in some ways. So to revisit some of those shibboleths against long-term narrative, against presentism, I think is really fundamental to what we do as historians, but as critical historians in that way. Yes, exactly.
I just had a question about your own work now, about civil wars.
Yeah.
And this is partially inspired by your article, What's the Big Idea? Your discussion there. And I was wondering, I was concerned about, like, what about Civil War analogs in non-European societies and between, I guess, Roman antiquity and the modern period where you pick it up again, the 18th century. And I'm concerned that I realized that you couch this in its comparison with Roman law. But I'm just wondering, does your continuation in the modern period, and especially in Syria, does that rather complicate matters in a way in which this layers on top of other societies and other traditions and their own civil war background? How do you deal with that?
Yes, exactly. No, it's a very important methodological question, one I deal with explicitly in the book. I say I'm not attempting to reconstruct the other conceptions of, in heavy quotes, internal conflict in, for instance, the Chinese tradition or the Arabic tradition, for instance, the tradition of fitna in Arabic, partly because remarkably, there's very little scholarship on those. I've asked my colleagues in Arabic studies or Middle East studies, or colleagues in Asian studies and Chinese studies, do we have parallel studies of these languages, of these conceptions? They're not there in the European languages. They're not even there often in Arabic or Chinese, for instance, to allow the possibility of synthesis. So I dodged that bullet in one sense to say, I hope that my study of this larger, very, very heavy scale quotes, Western conception of civil war, or conceptions of civil war, I hope this will inspire parallel studies which will answer exactly that question. But that's as a negative side. The positive side, I say, that Western conception of civil war has in fact become globalized through the institutions of international governance and through the globalization of social science in the latter part of the 20th century. So even though it's certainly not the only game in town, or even though that set of conceptions is not the only game in town, it is the only one that has been globalized, and therefore the only one that gets hybridized or semi-domesticated or articulated with these other conceptions in other areas. So that's the reason I've chosen it. I don't want to tell a diffusionist story. I don't want to tell a story of this as the universalization of a European concept that if one looks at, for instance, just almost etymologically or semantically, how bellum civile becomes civil war, becomes Bürgerkrieg in German, becomes Гражданская война in Russian, and then moves from German into Japanese, or German into Chinese, and then from Chinese into Japanese in the 19th century. That conception of civil war as a war among fellow citizens, that is, those who recognize themselves to be members of the same political community, that goes global even by the end of the 19th century into Asia in particular, as something quite different from conceptions of fitna or the Chinese equivalents, which have very different sorts of valences to them and often come into collision in that way. So one has to be very suspicious reading, say, the New York Times accounts of people on the ground in Syria saying we're in a civil war, without knowing exactly what the Arabic equivalent of that might be, for instance. But when they say, we know we're in a civil war because we remember what happened in Lebanon, then it gets interesting in terms of the layering of historical memory in comparison to recent conflicts, rather than just the merely conceptual, semantic use of the term as well. You're absolutely right, it is a major problem that I'm trying to weasel my way out of.
I think we're out of time. So